Hello, fellow cynics. Just wanted to jump in at the top of the episode here and do a little bit of a content warning. If you listen to this with kids or you're sensitive to particular topics, maybe set this one out. Today we'll be discussing gun violence, which necessitates some discussion about self-harm, mass shootings, violence in general. If any of those topics are disturbing to you, join us next week.
Welcome back to the Happy Cynics, everybody. We are going to tackle an independent topic, or it's a central topic today. We're going to just kind of tease this out, where I don't think either the iDog or Dr. K is going to have some big solution for the gun problem in this country. But maybe we can kind of bat this around a little bit and bounce some ideas off of each other. So the question is gun control.
Or I might frame it more like gun violence.
Okay. Stemming gun violence in the United States. So there's a couple things that we could talk about here. So why don't we kind of like throw out, this is a little different than what we've done before. Let's kind of toss out some different aspects of this we'd like to get to during this episode to talk about. Like, for example, you said something about wanting to talk about the demilitarization of the police.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like two sides to this issue that get painted, but that's always going to be an oversimplification, right? So you have the Democrats who are generally in favor of removing guns from the populace.
Mm-hmm.
So strict gun control laws, and then like buyback programs for guns that they don't feel that the general populace has any reason for owning.
Right. Right.
And then you have the Republican side, which is loosening gun control across the board.
Yes. Okay. All right, that's one aspect. Another aspect I would like to make sure we get to at some point is just American culture in general, and I guess raise the question, are we a violent culture? And if we are a violent culture, then what does that say about what we're going to have to accept as the norm under which we live? I'll give you an example, just really quick. I don't want to get into this just yet, but for example, like the death penalty. The death penalty tends to be kept on the books in places that have higher murder rates. But yet there's not really any evidence that the death penalty serves as a deterrent for murder, but yet when you're living in an area where there's more violent people, then it kind of raises the bar of what everybody has to do to feel safe. But anyway, I want to get to talk about that. At some point, we should make sure we at least maybe bat around a little bit the Second Amendment. And even then, like what from between that and what you were mentioning, to me, there's a difference between, say, people wanting to protect themselves, whether it like, there's one thing to like protect yourself against criminals, and then maybe, I guess the question is, to what extent is it legitimate to protect oneself against possible government intrusion?
Mm-hmm.
I guess at that point, I'm not really sure why you would go into an all-out war with personal war with the government anyway, because it's just a matter of time till you get captured and imprisoned anyway, or killed. Unless you just want to take some people out with you whenever you go.
I think the the role of guns in protecting vulnerable people from, I'll say, government brutality, because it's not just police brutality.
Right.
But the police are certainly an aspect of it, an important and central part of what brutality looks like. Although I don't necessarily see guns as like a viable way of like overthrowing the U.S. military, and I don't think anybody really thinks that.
Well, yeah. Don't people think that like there's all kinds of Russians that would like to see Putin out of power?
Right.
I mean, even in like Germany, how many people were trying to plot against Hitler, even amongst his own leaders? You just have to have enough people that are following orders to basically keep the threats in check.
Right. It's I see guns in that aspect sort of like how the Black Panthers would have used them in the 70s and 80s, late 60s, where they were seeing indiscriminate brutality directed against minorities in their community.
Right.
So what they would do is drive around, and anytime that there was a police interaction with somebody in their neighborhood, they would just watch. And while they watched, they carried assault rifles.
Mm-hmm.
There were very, very few interactions like that where any violence occurred.
Mm-hmm.
But the guns acted as very, very tangible accountability for the police officers in those scenarios.
Right.
Okay, you can pull us over, you can give us a ticket, you can search us for drugs, but if you plant something or if you start beating us or something like that, then we're here to protect our people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see that as a very legitimate form of violence mitigation with deterrence, which I think the death penalty doesn't function that way, right? Because the people who are going to commit violent crimes are not acting rationally. So like if your penalty for murder is the death penalty, the person committing murder isn't thinking through what the consequences for this are going to be.
Right. Right.
I think it's very similar with like mass shooters, serial killers, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was reading an article. I can't remember how long ago this was, but it was this one county in Michigan where Governor was it Gretchen Whitmer?
Mm-hmm. That's the current governor.
Yes, where they had passed some kind of red flag laws about guns. Well, then this one county decided that they weren't going to follow it. And so they actually gave like some kind of award to the sheriff for not enforcing the gun laws.
Well, Michigan's an interesting place because it's a swing state, but it has strong, especially right now, the Democratic Party there is very strong. But even Democrats in Michigan tend not to be in favor of stricter gun control because it's a state that has a very rich natural wildlife sort of heritage.
Right.
And a lot of people go hiking in bear country. They go hunting. I mean, that's a very integrated part of Michigan culture.
Well, and okay, so just a little commentary because the Democratic Party needs to come to grips with the fact that they no longer have the blue collar vote. And that's part of the shift that's going on in this country with the decline of unions. Unions used to be the means of loyalty between blue collar people and the Democratic Party. But now the unions have declined in power and influence. They're, again, at a grassroots level, a lot of the rhetoric coming from the Republican Party, I think a lot of blue-collar people resonate with that. Now, here's the thing. So coming back to gun control, unless there's something you wanted to say on that. I didn't want to take us down
Well, I mean, that's
rabbit
another
hole.
interesting. Michigan's a bit unique on that topic as well because the UAW is still very, very powerful in Michigan.
Right.
I mean, like a week and a half ago, Biden gave an address at the UAW meeting in Michigan.
Right. Right. The only place where I think you still would have but you still have the auto industry. It's not what it used to be, but the Teamsters, I think there's still influence there. But again, the Democratic Party needs to, I'm not saying the Democratic Party should cut the rhetoric about gun control and all that, because I do think that there needs to be something done. It's just like the same thing with the border crisis. And that's what's funny. Okay. So when it comes to gun violence, there are a lot of Democrats that'll say they'll talk, but then they won't actually cast it. When they had the opportunity to pass legislation, they didn't do it. And the same thing with Republicans griping about immigration, and yet when they have the opportunity to do something about it, they won't do something about it. And I think voters need to kind of keep that in mind. I think it's interesting that the Democrats are so uniform on gun control and implementing red flag laws when it is a pretty universally unpopular policy in America. Right.
Now, I think there does need to be a solution for gun violence. It would be an unpopular opinion, like an unpopular policy move, even for me, to implement stricter gun control laws.
Yes. So here's the thing that I would maybe suggest we're already started, but as a starting point for getting into gun violence. A lot of times this is discussed in terms of rights. And I realize that this country is founded on, the Constitution has a Bill of Rights. Okay. So you have that and you have the amendments and such. But I really don't think that gun violence is something that's going to be resolved by talking about everybody's individual rights. When it comes to things like crime, violence, war, talking about rights seems misplaced. To me, the driving force needs to be what is going to be most effective. So I tend to be a pragmatist. To me, it's less important about whether somebody's entitled to own certain guns or the police are entitled to have certain weapons at their disposal versus what is going to be the most effective way to de-escalate gun violence and reduce gun violence in this country. I guess the question is, we wouldn't have to restrict ownership if we could influence people's behavior. But I guess the question is, can we really influence people's behavior? And is that going to be effective? And even if it's effective for most people, are there going to be enough people slip through the cracks? So that really is kind of, I think, where the bar has been raised. It's always raised with technology. The more technology advances, the higher the bar goes. So, for example, all right, just take the automobile, okay? If we go back, say, over 100 years ago, and the top speed for an automobile was 30 miles an hour. I know people were petrified even to ride at 30 miles an hour because they weren't used to that kind of speed. But obviously, a car going at 30 miles an hour, of course, those vehicles were a lot heavier. Imagine like a vehicle today weighing, and maybe some of the trucks and such do, weigh what like an old Model T did.
Well, the new Hummer EV is like one of the heaviest production vehicles ever made.
Yeah, so imagine that thing hitting somebody, having a collision going at 70, 80 miles an hour. And I guess what I want to say is it's just like the same thing that NASCAR faced. And they started trying to tighten up restrictions after Dale Earnhardt got killed in that crash. Mm-hmm. We were watching that race actually when that happened. But that's the thing. The cars go faster. You try to make them lighter, and there's less protection. Well, the bar gets raised. So you can't afford to let people get by with all this kind of bump and run stuff that used to go on in NASCAR all the time, because it now becomes too dangerous to do that. And see, that's the thing here with the guns. If we were still using muzzle loaders like they were at the time of the writing of the Constitution, who would care if somebody owned 300 muzzle loaders, or whatever, because you're only going to get a shot every so many seconds anyway. But now that you've got, this became a thing like with organized crime, even about 100 years ago when they had machine guns, with these magazines that would go around. And now we've got this stuff to where, oh my golly, that's the thing. So whenever, let's say, guns were less powerful, they couldn't hold as many bullets. Well, then if somebody, flips their wig or whatever and shoots their shotgun off, they're going to do some damage, but not like somebody with an assault weapon, like it's developed for modern warfare. And even like warfare today, this is part of isn't this part of the thing about the Israel-Palestine issue is you can't be, with the weaponry that we have today, is it justifiable to be as indiscriminate in killing and looting or whatever, destroying things and people, as it might have been, say, during World War II or World War I, or even earlier, say, a Civil War, American Civil War. So anyway, I guess, so this brings me back to my question. Even if we could influence people's behavior, is that even going to be enough? Because I guess hypothetically, even one person who's unstable getting a hold of these weapons can do a lot of damage. I guess it depends on how much collateral damage we're willing to live with. And that's what's kind of shocking to me, is how many people seem to be perfectly willing to live with school shootings on a regular basis now.
Yeah, I don't know if the amount of damage that a modern weapon can do really plays all that much of a role. So like in the UK, they have had basically a flat out gun ban for the populace for decades.
Okay.
And when they implemented these policies, knife crime shot through the roof.
Right.
And now the Labour Party of the UK is proposing a knife ban. So you can't have knives anymore because you can do violence with them.
Right.
I'm not proposing that that's like a slippery slope in terms of like restricting access to certain weapons, but I will say that America already has pretty severe restrictions on what you can and can't own. So like you can't own a grenade launcher. You can't own a fully automatic weapon. You can't own certain magazine sizes. That's all already true. So you can own semi-automatic rifles. You can own semi-automatic pistols in certain calibers with certain magazine sizes. That's all pretty much in place.
Okay, so where do you come down on? So I've heard this in terms of expressed this way. Well, the criminals are going to get their weapons anyway because they'll get them illegally. It doesn't matter what the laws are. So private citizens should not be restricted because we need to arm ourselves to protect ourselves. Other people on the liberal side argue, well, yes, there are going to be some people that are going to insist on getting their weapons and they'll still be able to shoot people. But perhaps we will be able to stem the violence or reduce it. Would that not be worth it? So where do you come down on that?
Most weapons used in crime,
right?
Particularly like mass shooting weapons, are legitimately owned. Now, when it comes to like everyday gun violence that doesn't make the news, those are illegally obtained. They have the identification number scratched off, the VIN number scratched off. They're not.
Right.
Those kind of gun sales are a product of a very saturated gun market that you can then support a black market.
Right.
So, I mean, if we're talking about like market solutions to gun violence, I don't know if there's like a practical way forward there of like, well, we're just going to reduce the number of guns that are present in our society. My biggest question, I kind of think about this issue in terms of equality and authority, is whose guns are you taking away? And how is that going to shift the balance of power in society? Right? So if you're only taking away guns that are used by gang members in inner city settings, so we're talking about mostly handguns.
Right.
How does that affect the dynamic with other groups that want to do violence or may do violence between those, cultural barriers? Particularly in that case, I think it would be the police, right?
Right.
Because they're the closest, friction group to inner city gangs.
Right.
The Second Amendment, I don't think functions the way Republicans think it functions. It's designed to arm the populace in the case of like, we need to call up an immediate military force.
Right.
To defend the United States. That's really what that amendment is referring to.
We're being invaded by the Navajo.
Right. And we need a well-regulated militia, and people can only learn how guns work if they own and use them regularly.
Right.
When it comes to the self-defense thing, if the Republicans' take is, well, everyone has a right to own firearms, then the right to own a firearm should be guaranteed by a government body. So everyone should be issued a handgun at some point. Otherwise, it becomes just a war of the rich on the poor.
Yes. Right. Because the only way the poor can get weapons is to steal them.
Right. And I think like a good illustration of this was 2020, the Black Lives Matter riots.
Right.
Those protests. In some places, you had white supremacy groups show up armed to the teeth with guns, intending to do violence to Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters. However, you also had groups like the John Brown Gun Club and the Socialist Rifle Association show up to defend the protesters. And that defuses the situation, because if both parties have guns in that sort of a scenario, everyone gets a little bit too nervous to actually shoot.
Yeah.
But in the scenarios where the armament was unequal, where the counter protesters showed up and, BLM or Antifa or whoever had no means of protecting themselves, that's where you saw the most violence.
Okay. So, let me ask you then, to what extent is this analogous to the argument that every nation in the world ought to have a nuclear weapon?
I think it's pretty straightforward that it is analogous, that the nations who are nuclearly armed wield an unduly amount of influence over global proceedings. I'm not for nuclear proliferation,
but is that because they have the weapons and everybody's afraid they might use them if they don't get their way, or is it just because they have the weapons because the other nations can't afford to have those weapons? And what really the way they're really controlling things is through money.
Well, it just so happens that the nations who are nuclearly armed also tend to benefit the most from the IMF's policies and World Bank policies.
Yes.
I don't know if there's a direct correlation, but they do, I don't know if there's a line of causation, I should say, but there is a correlation between countries who have nukes and countries who benefit from globalist policies generally.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that the big players, say the U.S., China, U.S., Russia. I'm not sure who would come in next.
UK, France.
And France, yeah. Germany. At some point, India, but I'm not sure if they're quite there yet. But I think, let's put it this way. I think the primary influence of these countries has to do with economics, but they don't always limit themselves to just economics. So, eventually China's probably going to invade Taiwan, and dare us to try to stop them or whatever. It's just like Russia and even the United States, where we've gone into places and kind of seized control, for this reason or that reason. There's people like, is it Oliver Stone? Others that say, oh, yeah, we're just doing this for capitalistic interest, business interest, and under the guise of democracy and freedom and such. And it's really about us controlling economies.
Almost the entire modern history of Latin America is about U.S. interventions to protect democracy.
Yeah.
That just happened to enrich, American corporations.
Well, the Spanish and the Portuguese did it first, and then that gave us a good excuse that, we're going to come in and undo what they did. And the question is, did we do the same thing? Now, back to my question. So would there be more world peace if every nation had a nuclear bomb? Or are we just setting ourselves up for a Planet of the Apes scenario?
I mean, I think the obvious answer is that it's a Planet of the Apes scenario if everybody has a nuclear weapon.
Right.
The ideal would be nuclear disarmament.
Right. But that's not going to happen.
And I think the same would be true when it comes to gun violence.
Right.
Like, the ideal would be nobody needs a gun for self-defense.
Okay.
That guns are a tool for hunting, maybe. And
right.
I think the other thing to acknowledge is, like, most Americans who own guns use them as recreational tools.
Yes.
Right. I go out and shoot for fun.
Except,
I think, except
when
they don't.
You mentioned the 1960s scenarios. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of, like, these people that, say, in Arizona went out to polling places on election day carrying weapons. Now, what is that all about? Unless they're trying to influence. I mean, they could say, "Oh, we're trying to stop, voter fraud and whatever."
Right. I mean, that's pretty blatant voter intimidation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like the old elections in Chicago where the mob stood there by the
Right.
the voting box and, told everybody for whom to vote.
Or, elections in the South during the Jim Crow era.
Yes.
Where, if you were black, you just didn't show up.
So where would we start? Like what kind of reasonable, we can talk all we want about, what could, I don't know. I mean, there are other countries that do seem to be less violent. I'm trying to think. Scandinavia seems to have low crime rates, if I'm not mistaken. There are several island nations that tend to have low crime rates.
I mean, Japan has a famously low rate of crime.
Yes.
A lot of Asian countries generally have very low crime rate.
Yeah. So what accounts for that? Intelligence? I mean, I'm just being blunt here.
I think the obvious reason is because those countries tend to invest strongly in public education.
Yes.
And that the public education tends not to leave people out based on their intelligence, right? So in Japan, you can pick a career track early on. And you're not like dedicated to that for life, but it does allow people who are not as book smart or like good at school tasks a path forward without just being left out of the system entirely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's also a greater sense of independence early on in life in these countries.
Okay, I'm gonna bracket my intelligence comment because I really do think that is a big factor. I think that's why those countries value education more.
Right.
Even think about parenting. Okay, who are the parents that end up spanking their kids the most? The parents who don't know how to discipline or instruct their children without using violence. I mean, if you learn how to influence your child without having to wallop them, if you're a reasonable person, you'd want to do that. Spanking should be a last resort.
There's a wealth of resource that points to spanking as universally traumatizing, regardless of one's relationship with your parents. Spanking shows physiologically trauma responses in terms of brain chemistry and stuff like that. And the research is, maybe 15 years old. It's like recent, but it's been backed up over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think generally that could be a thing you would point to that would say, well, maybe this is one of the reasons that we have such a high rate of violence in our society is because we are instilling trauma in children from the start as our primary parenting strategy.
Yes.
Now, the other thing I think would be important to discuss here is who are the primary victims of gun violence.
Right.
Because a lot of times we only think of this in terms of like school shootings or the mass shooting at the Super Bowl parade that just happened.
Right.
Like, those things are tragic and terrible and we should take steps to mitigate that sort of event.
Right.
But the vast majority of death by gun is suicides by males.
Yeah.
By like a massive margin.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
The part of what we as a culture probably need to wrestle with is that suicide is a taboo here. There is no legitimate way of committing suicide, and other cultures have those sorts of things built into them.
Right.
But also, if we take guns away from those who may commit suicide, they will find other ways.
Sure.
Maybe be unsuccessful and get the help they need.
Right.
But at some point, we have to come face to face with the idea that some people just don't want to be alive anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's a question that our culture is ill-equipped to address.
Yes. And if you want to talk about that when we can, but if you disagree, I actually think that gun violence, when it comes to suicide, is a different issue than gun violence, like shooting somebody else.
The question is, would you label it a social problem or a private problem?
I agree, but I think the gun is using the same means to a much different end. And so I do realize that whatever policies we have about gun ownership needs to address both of those. And we can talk about that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, see, that, let's put it this way. It would be an overlap in the sense that somebody who might be suicidal may also decide to act out, their problems on other people. Like you have these people that do the murder-suicide thing. You're going to take some people out with them before they go.
And I'm pretty sure we have enough mass shootings in our history now that we can see the trends here are that people who have a lot of mental health problems generally tend to be white males and generally belong to some fringe far-right subculture are the people most likely to commit mass shooting.
Yes. Here's the thing. I would have to do some more. Okay, you're the sociologist. I'm not. It does seem to me that when we're talking about cultures and tendencies toward violence, I do think not just homogeneity of a culture affects it. I think diversity is a great and wonderful thing, but I think that a lot of people have difficulty, like they're afraid of people that they don't really understand, whether they should be or not. I think it makes everybody edgier to a certain extent. I'm not saying that causes people to act out in violence, but here's another thing. The countries where it seems like there's less violence, like you were mentioning Japan, I mentioned Scandinavia, those are areas that go way back to early tribes of humans that settled in those regions centuries and centuries, millennia ago. And that's different. Like the United States is a place where actually we don't read a lot about, say, Native American on Native American gun violence. They were the indigenous people here.
Well, and in fact, if you read the history of violence in indigenous cultures in America, there was very little violence.
Right.
I mean, even wars were like sort of half-hearted attempts at solving disputes between territories, but they were never like wars we would talk about it in a European sense.
Right. The colonization by European countries, that's how we came about, and then we started practicing the same thing on others. I want to say there's a difference between I think that countries that were the result, or let's put it this way, have been impacted by colonization tend to have a lot more exploitation and class warfare because of that, as opposed to countries that they went through their class struggles and things eons ago and kind of settled through, because this colonization stuff that we're talking about has only been a couple centuries ago. It really hasn't played itself out, at least it seems to me, in the sense that I mean, this is part of Marx's analysis that we're just continuing like the feudalistic state. And it's moved from these older countries into these colonized places. And what was colonization except for like an extended feudalism? So in other words, instead of these European countries fighting amongst themselves in feudalistic class warfare, they decided to turn their attentions to lesser economic developed areas and those indigenous populations and exploit them instead. And so we go in there, we enslave people, we even go to places and carry people, ship people out to work as slaves. In these countries, the economies are all built on exploitation of laborers. And so what recourse does the average person have except to fight back with violence? Because you're kept economically poor so that you can't afford to rival your overlords. Maybe I'm sounding maybe a bit too Orwellian here.
No, I think you're right. I think a lot of when it comes to like our immediate context, I feel like class warfare has sort of been hijacked by like the woke, anti-woke
right.
narrative.
Right.
And I think that's why you see a lot of that violence coming from the far right instead of like a proletariat violent revolution, the way Marx would have envisioned it.
Well, we did have that a few years back. It didn't develop like the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Right. That wasn't strictly violent, though, as much as it was just stubborn.
Well, right. You could say Black Lives Matter. Okay. That is, I mean, again, the right wing, like Black Lives Matter is woke. So it's like they're on opposite sides of the issue. And, there it is. So on one hand, oh my golly, it's like nobody wins because on one side, there's a lot of crime. So like in inner city communities where there's poverty and other things going on, there's a lot of violence and crime. And so it's very dangerous for police officers. And then police officers end up getting killed in the line of duty. Then their backlash is you have a number of officers that maybe carry things too far, did carry things too far. Okay. So then the population comes back, pushing back against that. And then that gets interpreted, oh no, they're defending all the criminal activity of what the police were trying to stop to begin with. And now you just got this art. Now it's escalated to a point where everybody, like both sides, have crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed. And now because everybody's crossed a line, there's no way to referee the thing. It's just like an all-out shout down or battle.
Well, there has been, along those lines, there's been some progress with like, and what was the city where George Floyd was killed?
Up in Wisconsin.
Was it Wisconsin or Minnesota?
It might have been Minnesota. There was one thing, wasn't around Milwaukee, and then there was another one up, maybe it was Twin Cities.
Well, I mean, anyway, the city where George Floyd was killed has now started implementing, like, instead of responding to every 911 call with police presence, they've sent social workers, like well-trained social workers for certain scenarios. And there's less of like a militarized police response to certain calls.
Yeah. Minneapolis,
right. Yeah. Obviously. And that has done a lot to reduce violent interactions between police and suspected criminals or criminals themselves. part of my resistance to gun violence is how militarized the police have become.
Yeah.
And you could say that this is a bit of a chicken and an egg because,
Right.
well, police have militarized in response to growing gun violence.
And riots.
Right. And so, but now that police training rhetoric in a lot of places, not everywhere, and it's obviously different depending on where you live, but a lot of the rhetoric of police training is you need to be afraid of anybody that you interact with in the public, which is so obviously unhealthy and part of the root cause of police violence. That, like,
I mean, I agree.
Is
but
sort of a
I agree, but what would you tell if you had a son or
escalation.
daughter that was going to be a police officer, especially in a big city somewhere? I mean,
I would probably tell them not to be a police officer.
I mean, a guy that rode my school bus, he was several years younger than me. He became a state police officer and was killed just making a traffic stop. Was shot by the guy when he went up to his window. And I'm not saying that justifies, the police having, assault weapons and that, but I mean, I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I do think there are situations that call for, more drastic measures. But so what would you like to see happen? The police never have those kinds of weapons?
Well, I think it requires, I wouldn't say that. I think it requires an entire restructuring of the way local governments relate to the citizens that live there.
Okay.
And then that needs to be carried all the way through to the top levels of government. That the adversarial relationship between the average citizen and the government is not sustainable, especially in a democracy.
In what way is it not sustainable?
Because if the average citizen sees their government and playing by the rules as something that only ever plays into the favor of the other group, right? Whether that be the rich or those who live on the other side of the train tracks or whatever. People are never going to choose to play by the rules because they don't feel like they're part of it, right? They're just being taken advantage of.
Right.
And I think this is particularly escalated in today's economy with millennials and Zoomers who are in much worse financial situations than Gen X or the baby boomers were before them, right? So now you have an economy where most people that are younger will never own property. And there's very little regulation on how much rent can be charged. So you have a generation who gives most of their labor value to their landlord, isn't growing any property wealth because they don't own anything, and has very little hope in terms of moving upward in the world into a place where they don't have to be somebody's tenant. I mean, this is, back to Marx, this is new feudalism.
Yeah.
You can see where that sort of environment where then you have, boomers directing public funds towards private entities and not funding any social programs, that engenders, my only way of getting forward in life is by breaking the rules.
Right. I do agree that accounts for a significant portion. But there are also...
And that's what I mean by like an adversarial relationship between the law and the average person.
No, I agree. And I know you're not saying that's like a panacea that would cure everything. I also think
No.
Well,
Yeah.
so what do we do about the people that are just like they've got a chip on their shoulder about something, or it's just like, I don't care what people tell me, or society says, I'm going to do what I want to do. I mean, let's say, even if we go back and look at, say, somebody like John Dillinger. Yeah, it was the Depression, but I don't know. I mean, from all accounts, I mean, I don't think that what made somebody like Dillinger tick, it was just, oh, well, gee, I've had a hard luck story. I'd like to be a law-abiding citizen, but it's the only way I can make a decent living. I mean, there are people that just want to make a quick, easy buck, and they don't care, or, they get ticked off at somebody, they don't care, and they'll just shoot them. I mean, I'm thinking about even, okay, we're both not that far from Chicago. So it's just like, how many times now have there been like some younger brother or sister shot because of their older brother belonging to a gang or something. And so there is, I think that again will reduce it some, but yet there's a certain amount of violence that just takes place.
Well, I mean, how much of Chicago violence, though, is instilled into young gang members by their parents?
Yes.
Who were gang members when they were kids.
Right.
So you have to, I think parenting is sort of the answer to your question.
Yes.
And I don't think it's something that like, we're never going to solve that permanently. There's always going to be people who act antisocially. But when it comes to like Chicago gangs, so much of that is inherited through the parents that you have to go back a couple generations and look at what these Chicago gangs were formed from in the first place, which is that sense of like, okay, so you look at the most infamous spot in Chicago for gang violence is O Block, which is like 4 blocks from the University of Chicago. Right. Hyde Park is generally a nice place.
Right.
This is right on the border of Hyde Park.
Right.
O Block used to be, and it's where like Michelle Obama was born.
Right.
Back in the day was a cooperative housing unit. The city of Chicago didn't like that it was cooperatively owned, stepped in, bought the property, and turned it into what it is today, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't want the housing market to not be private.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's privately owned. And part of the reaction to that was, well, you have this community, a mostly black community, that just had what they were building their community around ripped away from them by the city government.
Yeah.
That adversarial relationship is what engenders that violence, which then goes on generationally to produce what you have now, which is pretty much senseless violence.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense to me. I'll accept that. I think that's right. Yeah. I guess we just have to kind of make progress with each upcoming generation. It's sad, and I don't care whether it's what color, skin or ethnicity or race we're talking about. It's just sad when, I mean, no parents are perfect. Okay. So everybody's got things that we want to improve on beyond what we're given by our parents and grandparents, etc. But there's also a sense where sometimes bad patterns need to be broken and new ones established, and that can only happen if somebody kind of steps in and helps the younger generations for consistently to help several successive generations to have better patterns and lifestyle choices. that will greatly increase their chances for success. And it's interesting how so many of these social ills end up getting tied back to gun violence, because gun violence is probably one of the, I want to say, most surefire way, and that's probably not the best term to use. But sometimes the most effective way of rebelling against the system or pushing back.
When you have nothing to lose.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're afraid, if you're feeling like you're going to end up in prison anyway, because you're having to do things illegally to make some money.
Or, your situation's never going to get better.
Right.
You're never going to have, any sort of hope. You have nothing left to lose. What's to stop? And you have to give people something to live for, to be afraid of losing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So let me ask you, do you support that decision where they sentenced the mother, and I think the father's going to be going on trial, the parents of that one school shooter? Trying to remember where that was. Did you remember seeing that in the news within the last month or so?
I'm not familiar with the story you're talking about.
Let me see here. It was the one where the mother was charged
with negligence. Maybe?
Yes.
I'm trying to think of like what would be. I think the parents are certainly responsible, but I don't know how legally responsible they would be.
Yeah, it was the Michigan school shooter's mother. It was in Pontiac, Michigan. Yeah, Jennifer Crumbly. There it is. She was found guilty of manslaughter. Even if somebody doesn't agree with that particular verdict, do you think it's fair to hold parents accountable? Of, say, for example, if you know your son or daughter is struggling emotionally or has depression or whatever, that you need to get the weapons either locked up in a safe where they can't get to them, or get rid of them altogether?
Yeah, I do think parents should be held responsible for those sorts of things. I think one of the things that I am for, I think would go a long way in preventing some of these cases, which is publicly funded gun safety education.
Right.
Which is something that I think is a bit of like a political taboo to say, like, no, gun safety should be part of everyone's. If we're going to have guns around, like we already do, then we should know what safety measures and like basic common sense is around a gun. Everybody should know how to secure their weapons, how to maintain. I mean, like basic, just like gun safety should be part of public education.
Yes,
in my opinion, because our culture, whether you agree with it or not, is partially tied up in gun ownership.
Has that been brought up by any politicians as far as bills or anything?
Nobody.
Really?
Nobody wants to talk about this.
And maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but it's just interesting. I think every junior high kid ought to know how to know how guns work.
Sure, yeah.
And they should know how to use condoms too.
Yeah, but I totally agree. They're both sort of the same idea, though, of like, this is just basic safety and health education.
Yeah. I'm avoiding the use of euphemisms here, so I don't want. I'm not going to do that.
It's actually, there's historical precedent for gun safety classes in American public schools. It used to be everywhere. It was like universal. Schools had gun safety classes.
Right.
Schools had rifle teams, skeet shooting teams. That was pretty much everywhere.
Right.
Here.
Right.
And not that long ago. I mean, my dad's high school had a rifle team.
Wow.
And that was the 70s. So that's not that long ago.
Well, where I went to school, even in elementary school, like sixth graders, you could take a hunter safety course.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to be able to hunt.
Well, yeah, in Michigan, you have to take a hunter safety course to get your hunting license.
It may not have been at 12 years old. I can't remember when it was. I can't remember what the minimum age was.
I mean, it's pretty young even
thought
today.
It was like 13 or something, but maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you're allowed to hunt as a child.
Wow.
Obviously, you have to have an adult supervisor, but
yeah, hopefully. I need to get one of those for Dick Cheney. Anyway, you remember when he accidentally shot the other guy in the face?
Remember.
Well, anyway, gee whiz.
I'm not that young.
Yeah,
I remember Dick Cheney
guy better
and all
find
of
a new
his
hunting
antics.
buddy. Well, anyway,
I remember there was a parody song called "Dick Cheney's Got a Gun." It came out around that time.
was it based
popular.
on the Van Halen "Janie's Got a Gun"? Cheney's got a gun.
Yes, it was that.
Yeah, Cheney's got a gun. Yeah, anyway, that was an old Van Halen song.
Yeah, they changed it to Dick Cheney's Got a Gun.
Well,
different times.
Yeah, okay, so let me ask you this. Are the background checks and such adequate for keeping people with mental health issues from going into gun shops and buying weapons?
I mean, I
don't
think
know
it's
much
pretty
about
obviously not, because everywhere has mandatory background checks. That's already in place.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of these school shooters, how many of them got their weapons legally or illegally.
I think most of the time they are borrowed weapons from family members.
Okay. Oh my. Yeah. So, are we going to come to that? So are we going to come to the situation where somebody that aids or abets somebody with a known history of depression or mental illness, if you give them access to a weapon and they use it, against...
I don't know if you can make a case for that, because, if I lend you my car and you hit somebody with it, am I responsible for your actions?
Yes, if you hand your keys to somebody that you know is drunk.
Oh yeah, I guess yeah, in that case there might be some liability that I think would be obvious in a court of law.
Yeah, I don't think anybody that has a history of mental illness or depression should be just handed or given a weapon under any reasoning.
But what if it's taken without the owner's knowledge?
Well, no,
the owner hadn't properly secured it. If you're keeping it in your bedside table, which doesn't have a lock on it, to what extent is that your responsibility to own a gun safe?
Yeah. I obviously there's not going to be a hard and fast rule. I think it would depend.
This is all stuff that I think would be helped with just basic gun safety classes.
Right. Yeah. And, even like defining what somebody's level of responsibility is whenever you're dealing with somebody who probably should not be given free access to a weapon. I mean, let's say use this as an illustration. Suppose it's not depression or mental illness. Suppose it's just, say, a 3 or 4 year old.
Right.
How many steps do we expect parents to take to keep the child from having access to that weapon? So did you ever see the old Alfred Hitchcock Presents episode where you remember who Billy Mummy was, the actor?
I don't know that.
Okay. Have you ever seen the old TV series Lost in Space?
No.
Oh, okay. Billy Mummy was an actor. He's several years older than me. I'm not sure. Probably about 10 years older than me. Something like that. Maybe not quite that much. There was this episode where he was a boy. He was, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7. I don't know. He wasn't that old, maybe even 5. Well, then his uncle comes to visit, and here the uncle has a gun in his suitcase, and his father and uncle go to talk about something, and he goes in and he's like dressed as wearing a cowboy hat with a fake pistol and stuff, trying to, playing cowboy. Well, then he goes rummaging through his uncle's stuff and ends up taking out a loaded gun and puts it in his holster instead of his toy gun. And then throughout the episode, they're like showing it from behind, like the barrel of the gun as he's pointing it to different people, and they don't realize it's a real gun until the end. So like, Alfred Hitchcock, you go through 20 minutes of this with him pointing the gun at different people, and I'm like, oh, don't shoot me, Billy, and not thinking that he only had a toy. But
yeah. Well, I mean, my family has owned guns. My parents were never like really big on gun ownership, but my mother was raised with the rule that like even toy guns don't get pointed.
Oh.
Ever. And so I was raised with that same rule.
Wow.
I mean, the 3 rules of gun safety were part of the rules with toy guns, which I think is a great move for parenting. That you teach weapons, even fake weapons, are good to respect.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, when it came to like airsoft or paintball, obviously there's exceptions.
Okay.
Because the point is,
you put a BB in some kid's butt.
Yeah.
You ever
right.
do that? Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But I mean, obviously, when you get older, there are exceptions. When you're playing paintball, you got to shoot at people.
Right.
But, when you start ingraining those rules from a young age and you start that gun safety education from a young age, then when a gun is in your presence, you know how to hold it, but you also don't have that like, oh, I've never been around guns and I'm afraid of this thing. Because I feel like that's where a lot of mistakes happen too.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so are we any closer to any kind of thoughts on gun laws? So it seemed to me that you were arguing that or leaning in the direction that our laws are already good enough. We just need to enforce them.
I don't know how, I mean, I'm not a policy expert, obviously, so I don't know how much more strict you can get without just being like straight up authoritarian.
Yeah.
Let
me ask you this.
I mean, my take is that the law is sufficient. And in fact, we should be doing more about gun safety from the other end of just education and, public programs about what gun safety is, and then also sort of defusing the relationship people have to their government. That's essentially my entire take.
Yeah. So I tried to hold this back towards the end, but I basically, when it comes to say gun ownership and like restrictions and things like that, I'm more inclined to say whatever a person has on their property to protect their home and their property, I'm more willing to let people own what they want to own in protecting their home. That doesn't give you the right to shoot down the police if they come to your house, or the FBI or somebody, if they're coming according to, acceptable lawful procedures. Okay. But where I would draw the line, I don't think all these people that have all these magazines that shoot, I don't know how many bullets in a few seconds and such, I don't think they're just all doing it just for recreation. They want to try to act tough and macho and intimidate other people. I think those weapons ought to stay on your property. If you take them off your property, then you get the cuffs slapped on you.
Well, I mean, fully automatic weapons, you can get your hands on fully automatic weapons.
Yes, you
but
can.
But most of them are vintage
right.
fully automatic weapons, right? So we're talking irrelevant in a modern combat scenario. Generally not usable fully automatic weapons. They are just for historical curiosity. The bump stock thing, that's pretty much... they have been used in a few mass shootings, but pretty much are controlled at this point. You can't get them.
Right. No, I mean, I understand.
And I think I agree with you that, like, you shouldn't be just walking around with, weapons of local mass destruction. I mean, I don't think you should. I am genuinely of the opinion, if you want to own a grenade launcher, you should be able to own a grenade launcher. But I do agree that you can't bring it into public.
Right. It's got to stay on your property, and those grenades better stay on your property too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you got to have a big piece of property.
Well, yes.
And probably not within any town boundaries, because you're generally not allowed to shoot any guns within a town's within town property. I mean, you have to be out in unincorporated.
I mean, it makes me nervous knowing that there's people that want to stockpile their homes, like to have their own small army. That makes me nervous. But I would be willing to live with that as long as these folks keep it at home and they're not taking it off their property and imposing it on everybody else. It's no different than if you want to let your 5-year-old drive your automobile around your front yard. I guess that's your business as long as they don't get hurt. Maybe a 5-year-old's not the best illustration. Let's say a car that you don't have licensed. Okay. You own a vehicle that doesn't have a license. If you're just going to keep it on your farm and use it as a farm vehicle, unless there's specific laws that society has voted on duly and say that even farm vehicles have to be licensed and if they're being used for such and such a purpose. But I'm just saying hypothetically, I don't have a problem if somebody without a driver's license is driving a car on their own property where they can't be a threat to anybody else, but don't take that vehicle off your property.
Well, but isn't that kind of the case already? I mean, most places you're not allowed to carry other than you can either open carry a handgun or you have to get a concealed carry permit.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I don't know how tough the concealed carry permit is, though.
It changes very drastically depending on what state you live in.
Exactly.
So Indiana, where I live, is constitutional carry. That's what they call this.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the Constitution, but they call it constitutional carry, where anybody can conceal carry regardless. The only problem I have with that is that there is no gun safety education anywhere.
Right.
If gun safety education was part of our public education, I would have almost no problem with that.
This ought to be another part of it too. So for example, if you're going to be licensed to drive a car, you have to pass a test. You have to not only pass a knowledge test of the laws, you have to then show your skills. I think the same thing should be true for anybody that's going to be licensed to carry a gun. They need to, first of all, there needs to be some kind of rationale of why you need to have a weapon with you at all times. And that needs to be verifiable. Then second, they need to show that they understand how the weapons work and what all the current laws are about what you can and can't, how you can or can't use your weapon, and what constitutes self-defense and what is considered an act of violence. Okay. And then they should have to show that they have a certain amount of accuracy. I don't want somebody with a license with concealed carry if they can't shoot within 4 feet accuracy. If they pull a gun on somebody, if somebody's robbing somebody at the mall and they try to shoot them, what's to keep them from shooting an innocent bystander if they're no good with that gun? They need to show that they know how to use it. We can at least do that sort of thing. If we're going to have guns,
I think I agree with your points.
Go ahead.
Except for that, I don't know if you should necessarily have to share your rationale for why you want a concealed carry permit, other than, well, I just want it for self-defense. Because I feel like that's too easily manipulatable to be just like, well, we don't like why this person said they want a concealed carry, and so we're just going to say no to them.
Well, no. I'm saying there ought to be laws that say what is a justifiable reason for having a concealed carry weapon.
But couldn't just self-defense be the only reason anybody would ever give for that?
I guess, but here's the thing. I'm not against people being armed to protect themselves, people that are maybe in have some kind of risk. Okay. But the other way, I'm just afraid we're just going to end up like the Old West, where everybody walks around with a gun in a holster, and it's just, every so often somebody's going to fly off the handle and shoot somebody, and they end up in jail over it or get hung for it or whatever. And I don't know. I think it defeats the purpose. Like, again, I don't know what, it just kind of reminds me of what we were saying before about everybody having the nuclear weapon. Is that really going to, it's like, well, we need that weapon for self-defense. Well, I mean, truthfully, there are a lot of countries in the world that, is there really any basis that they're going to be under some kind of threat of attack? Why would somebody attack their country? If there's a tangible reason that they need to protect themselves, especially if they've been attacked before and were unable to defend themselves, then yeah, they ought to be able to have some weaponry to defend themselves. I think if somebody,
well, I mean, that's basically what NATO is, though.
Yeah. But isn't that kind of why we have like police and such too?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a tricky topic. I think right now the situation is you can conceal carry if you want.
Yeah.
And most people don't choose to.
Yes.
So what would be the rationale for adding a litmus test for like why you are at particular risk for gun violence and you need to carry your own weapon? It seems to me like most people don't feel the need to carry a gun on them at all times already. Yeah. And so even if you made the concealed carry laws be a little bit more like a driver's test, which I think I agree, I agree with that you should have to prove proficiency to conceal carry a gun. And that you should have to probably renew that every now and then. But I think even, if you opened up the laws, most people aren't going to go to the trouble.
No, I agree. I don't. Yeah. Maybe what I'm thinking of is the tail wagging the dog. It could be. I'm thinking of like that, what was it? What was his name? Trayvon Martin, where that guy kind of appointed himself as like the, neighbor.
Trayvon Martin in Florida.
Yeah. That one it was Zimmerman or whatever his name was that,
yeah.
Like he pointed himself as like kind of like the vigilante, crime watch neighbor or whatever. That's the thing. It's like, I don't have a problem with people say, well, I'd like to have a license in case I need a gun, or feel that I need one, like if I'm going to be going someplace that's really high crime or really risky or whatever. What worries me is the person that just looks forward to getting that permit because they want to have it with them all the time, whether they really need it or not, whether they feel afraid or not. That's the kind of person. And that's the thing. It's like, I'm not afraid of the people that really don't want to use guns unless they have to. I'm afraid of the people who just are looking for an excuse to use them. And I don't know how you sift those people out, except after the fact, after they've already shot somebody. I don't know. I get what you're saying, and that's why I say maybe I'm just thinking about the tail wagging the dog here. Maybe that's...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you bring up a good point, which is it's very tricky to weed out the people who are just kind of trigger happy.
Right.
I don't know if there is a way to do it without also sacrificing some essential freedoms.
Yeah, or discriminating against people.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would be very slow to trade liberty for security.
Yeah, need to watch V for Vendetta again. Anyway. Have you ever seen that movie?
So I've seen clips from it.
Oh, you need to watch the whole thing.
I know the story.
It's good. Anyway.
But I think my key takeaway from this is that in American politics, we often divide ourselves on this line.
Yeah.
Of Democrats are clearly pro-gun control, just want to take everyone's guns away. And Republicans are very clearly everybody should just have guns and there should be no restrictions on it. And we should just, everybody should just be able to conceal carry and there should be guns everywhere. And if there were more guns in school, then there would be no more gun violence.
And I venture to say, go ahead. I'm sorry, am I interrupting you? Go ahead. Finish your...
I mean, no, you're fine. Go ahead.
I venture to say that most people, if you ask them individually, they wouldn't support either party platform completely down the line. They would have something that's a little more reasonable, like, okay, everybody should be able to own guns, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to at least sift out a few of the risky, the people who are questionable as to whether they should have something. And maybe people around them should accept some responsibility to keep track of them. That's another thing too. It's like we're so bent on just looking after ourselves. We're going to have a hard time functioning as a society with increased technology and weaponry if we don't start looking out for our neighbors more. And that includes, we talked about this, after the 9/11 attacks, report suspicious activity. Well, that should happen all the time. I mean, if somebody is acting a little bizarre or whatever, then pay attention. I mean, do you see this person starting to carry talking about shooting or carrying, take some kind of steps to get somebody to check this out and see if there's anything there to worry about or not. We can't afford to wait until after the fact and say, gee, isn't that... Well, the answer is we just get rid of all the weapons. Well, okay, in a perfect world, yes. Or the answer is we just pass out guns to everybody. And that's what Archie Bunker said on All in the Family. He went on TV and... to do a rebuttal against the station manager who was calling out for stricter gun laws in New York City. And Archie Bunker said he could end the skyjackings by just handing out pistols to all the passengers, and then nobody would try to hijack plane because everybody would be armed. And at the end of the flight, you just collect all the guns again.
Yeah, that's what you want. You want a bunch of bullets all flying at once in a plane. I think I don't know if we're going to make any headway in solving this problem, but I just hope that we've introduced some cognitive dissonance in our listeners who are on either side of this issue.
Right.
That it's not quite so simple as just, well, if we just got rid of all the guns, then violence wouldn't be a problem. But it's also not as simple as just that gun violence isn't a problem at all.
Yeah. Yeah, whichever way you lean on an issue like this, it's never going to be a perfect solution. So it's you have to decide on which side would you rather live. Here's the thing. I think maybe we're living a little too far on accepting gun violence when it happens in favor of personal freedom. Maybe at least till things cool down or change, maybe. And again, I agree. We don't want to disarm the public. I don't think that everybody needs to be restricted, but we need to start being a little more careful as to who has a gun or who has access to these things, and start holding people more accountable. We're going to have to, at some point, become our brother's keeper again, or we're not going to survive very long, because if we don't start looking out for one another in society, one person who, slips a cog or something can really do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And it doesn't take too many times like that till everybody's confidence in the system evaporates and dissipates. And then I just don't want to see us end up in some kind of anarchy. Because the abuses of power and freedom will come from both sides, and it'll just keep escalating. And this will be my last thought on this. Don't buy into the rhetoric of people that their only concern is somehow to make money off of either generating controversy or selling weapons or whatever, however it is they're making money. Okay? Always be suspicious of people who are feeding you information if they're making money off of that somehow. They don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. They don't care if you shoot each other, as long as they can make some kind of money on it. And I'm sorry, that sounds a bit crass, but that's part of the history of this country. We've never really come fully to grips with that. Instead of just, hey, let's just all settle down here and let's all just live and coexist and learn to tolerate each other, we still get into these territorial, this is our land, this is our place. And, even though we took it off of the Native Americans. And anyway, I don't think that necessarily, you can't roll back the clock. And I'm not going to even comment on what that should or shouldn't have been. But it is what it is. And we just need to just settle down and learn to coexist peacefully with other folks. And we'll have to keep an eye out for one another. I mean, the answer is not so much that every person needs to be armed and capable of doing more damage. It's more that we all bind together and use our collective efforts to try to keep things in check. That's, I think, the most important thing. So anyway, any final word you want to add, Isaac?
Yeah, I'll just say that this issue is interconnected with a lot of issues.
Yes.
Equality, police brutality, mental health. I mean, it's a very complicated topic. And I just would hope that we approach it with some nuance and that we don't approach it out of fear, which I feel like is a lot of people's response to this is like, well, I'm just afraid of this. I'm afraid of all guns, all gun owners. I'm not going to try and educate myself about this at all because I have that fear reaction. And I don't think that that's a healthy way forward. And so I hope that if you're listening to this, you gain a little bit of curiosity about why people take certain stances on this and why it's not, I don't think it's reflected in the American public what the cut and dry black and white Democrat Republican split is on this.
Right. Exactly. It's more time that we also quit listening to demagogues and pundits and start having conversations with one another in people's own personal experiences, and do that by at least trying to have some kind of understanding and sympathy for the other person. And if we can start engendering that, then maybe there still is hope for this culture. I really do hope. I fear for how things could be for my grandson when he's my age. I hope things will be better. I really do. There's a lot of things that encourage me, a lot of things that make me fearful, and I guess that's part of getting older too. But nevertheless, we've enjoyed our time here today with you. Hope you found this helpful in some way, and we want you to be safe, be happy. We hope your week goes well. Reach out to us at thehappycynics@gmail.com, or leave us a review or comment on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, different places you find us. And we're looking forward to being again with you very soon. Take care. God bless.